Some betrayals cut so deep they leave scars that can never heal. Some secrets, once exposed, unleash a darkness no one sees coming. And sometimes, the person you trust the most is the one who holds the knife, literally. At first glance, Lionel and Tameka Warren had it all. A beautiful marriage built on faith, a thriving ministry, and a community that adored them. They stood before the congregation as proof that love, when rooted in God, could withstand any storm. Together, they prayed, preached, and guided others toward righteousness. But behind the church doors, behind the carefully curated image of devotion, something sinister was festering. No one knew it then, but a storm was already brewing, one that would leave blood on the floor, sirens wailing in the night, and a congregation reeling in disbelief. The moment it all unraveled came in the quiet hours of an ordinary evening. A home, a bedroom, a shocking discovery. One moment, life was as it had always been. The next, everything shattered. There was screaming. There was chaos. And then, there was silence. By the time the truth came to light, it was already too late. The headlines would tell one story. The trial would reveal another. But the real question remains, what really happened inside that house? And what drives a person to cross the line from love to murder? Before we unravel the chilling details of this case, make sure to like this video and subscribe. This is a tale of faith, deception, and the kind of betrayal that changes everything. Tameka Warren was the kind of woman people admired, graceful, strong-willed, and deeply devoted to her faith. She wasn't just the pastor's wife, she was the heartbeat of Triumph Tabernacle, the kind of woman who made faith feel tangible, who turned scripture into action. She led women's ministries, counseled troubled wives, and organized charity drives that fed hundreds. To those in the congregation, she was more than a spiritual guide, she was a role model, a symbol of what a God-fearing wife should be. Her life had always been one of discipline and sacrifice. Raised in a strict Christian household in Atlanta, Georgia, she had been taught from a young age that a woman's greatest calling was to support her husband and nurture her home. Her parents, deacons in their own church, instilled in her the belief that marriage was sacred, unbreakable, and ordained by God. And when she met Lionel Warren in college, she was convinced she had found the man God had chosen for her. Lionel was different from the boys she had known growing up. He wasn't just charming, he carried himself like a man with a purpose. With his smooth baritone voice, captivating presence, and unshakable confidence, he had an undeniable magnetism that drew people in. Even at 20, he spoke like a man destined for the pulpit, a man called to lead. And Tameka, who had always believed in the power of a strong, God-fearing husband, fell for him almost instantly. Their courtship was fast, but not reckless. Lionel wooed her with scripture, showering her with words that spoke of destiny in divine alignment. He told her that she was his Proverbs 31 woman, the kind of wife who would stand beside him as he built a ministry that would change lives. And for Tameka, there was no greater honor. When they married, it wasn't just a wedding, it was a community event. The grand church ceremony was attended by nearly everyone they knew. Elders prophesied over their future, speaking of the great things they would accomplish together. The congregation cheered as Lionel and Tameka took their vows, believing they were witnessing the beginning of something truly divine. And for a time, it seemed they were right. Under Lionel's leadership, Triumph Tabernacle flourished. His sermons could bring a congregation to its knees, his words moving through the crowd like fire, igniting faith in even the most broken souls. He had a way of making people feel seen, understood, forgiven. His ministry extended beyond the pulpit, he counseled wayward youth, brokered peace between feuding families, and established community programs that brought in millions in donations. Tameka stood faithfully by his side, the perfect first lady of the church. She had given up a promising career in business to devote herself entirely to the ministry. She managed the church's finances, coordinated events, and provided spiritual guidance to women struggling in their marriages. Every Sunday, she sat in the front pew, smiling up at her husband as he delivered his powerful messages. To the outside world, theirs was a marriage built on faith, love, and an unshakable foundation. Women in the congregation envied Tameka, believing she had the perfect husband, a strong, devoted man of God. Young couples sought their advice, hoping to replicate their seemingly flawless union. But perfection is often a carefully crafted illusion. Behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Small, barely noticeable at first, late-night meetings that ran longer than usual, unexplained absences, moments where Lionel seemed distant, preoccupied. Tameka, ever the devoted wife, dismissed these concerns, choosing to believe in the man she had married. After all, their love was blessed by God. Wasn't it? Lionel Warren had always known there was a part of himself he could never let see the light of day. From the time he was a boy, growing up in a household where faith was law and sin was punished, he understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak. The church had taught him early, there were sins God forgave, and there were sins that condemned a man forever. So, he buried his truth. He became the man everyone expected him to be, the devoted husband, the powerful preacher, the shepherd of lost souls. He convinced himself that his marriage to Tameka would purify him, that if he prayed hard enough, lived righteously enough, and loved her deeply enough, the feelings he fought against would disappear. And for a time, he believed it was working. But temptation had a way of finding cracks in even the strongest foundations. Rochelle Dillard had always been a presence in their lives. She and Tameka had been inseparable since childhood, the kind of best friends who finished each other's sentences and carried secrets no one else knew. Where Tameka was reserved, Rochelle was bold. Where Tameka was deeply devoted to the church, Rochelle had always been skeptical. She attended services when it suited her, but her faith was nowhere near as consuming as Tameka's. Still, they were sisters in spirit. Rochelle had been the maid of honor at Tameka's wedding, had whispered jokes into her ear as they stood at the altar, had wiped away happy tears as Lionel and Tameka said I do. For years, Rochelle had been like family. But things had changed. At first, Lionel and Rochelle's interactions were innocent. She had come to him for guidance, struggling with questions about her faith and the choices she had made in her personal life. She was unhappy, lost. She wanted to believe in something, but doubt clouded her heart. Lionel had counseled dozens of women before, single mothers, struggling wives, young girls trying to find their way. But something about Rochelle was different. She challenged him in a way others didn't. She questioned the parts of Scripture that others accepted without hesitation. She debated him, pushed him, made him see things from angles he had spent years avoiding. And late one night, after one of their many private counseling sessions, something shifted. A lingering glance. A touch that lasted a second too long. A moment of silence thick with everything neither of them wanted to say. Then, a kiss. It wasn't love, not in the way people spoke about love in the church. It was something else. For Lionel, it was control, proof that he was still the man he had spent his life pretending to be. Being with Rochelle was his way of proving, to himself, to God, to the world, that the urges buried inside him had no power over him. That he was the man he preached about on Sundays. For Rochelle, it was something more dangerous. Power. She had taken something that belonged to Tameka. And that alone made it worth it. The affair started as a single moment of weakness but quickly spiraled into something uncontrollable. They found stolen moments whenever they could, an embrace behind the church office, hushed whispers in the parking lot, late-night rendezvous in hotel rooms miles away from Triumph Tabernacle. Lionel knew it was a sin, but sin had never felt so necessary. Neither of them imagined that Tameka would find out. And neither of them could have predicted the way she did. July 24, 2024, the night had been unremarkable, just another evening dedicated to the church. Tameka had spent hours at the women's ministry meeting, leading prayers, offering guidance, and listening to the struggles of the women in her congregation. She had left the church feeling fulfilled, her spirit lifted, her faith unwavering. It wasn't until she was halfway home that she realized she had left her Bible behind. Not the one she used for preaching, but the one filled with her personal notes, prayers, reflections, scriptures underlined and circled with the kind of intimacy that only came from years of devotion. She turned the car around, but as she pulled into the driveway, she noticed something strange. The house was dark. Lionel was supposed to be at home, and he always left the porch light on for her. It was a small thing, a habit formed early in their marriage. But tonight, the porch was shrouded in darkness. A flicker of unease settled in her stomach, but she brushed it off. Maybe he had gone to bed early. Maybe he had forgotten. She didn't call ahead. She didn't knock. It was her home. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. That was when she heard it. A sound. Muffled. Low. A woman's voice. Tameka froze. At first, she thought it was the television. Maybe Lionel had fallen asleep with one of his late-night programs playing. But no, there was a rhythm to the sounds, an unmistakable cadence of pleasure. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she moved through the house, her feet silent against the hardwood floor. The closer she got to the bedroom, the clearer the sounds became. The breathy moans. The hushed laughter. The rustling of sheets. She reached the door. She pushed it open. For a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. Lionel. Her husband. The man who had vowed before God and their congregation to be faithful. He was kneeling between Rachel's legs, his mouth pressed against her, his hands gripping her thighs. Rachel's head was thrown back, her lips parted, a moan escaping her throat. The sheets were a tangled mess beneath them, the air thick with the scent of sweat and sex. Time fractured. A metallic taste filled Tameka's mouth, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to lunge, to do something, but her body was frozen, trapped in the hellish reality before her. Lionel turned. His lips were still wet. His eyes locked onto hers, widening in horror. Rachel gasped, clutching at the sheets, scrambling to cover herself. The Bible slipped from Tameka's fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. A soundless moment stretched between them. Then Rachel spoke, her voice high and shaky. Tameka. The sound snapped Tameka out of her trance. You disgust me, she whispered. Her voice was raw, stripped of the warmth and grace that had always defined her. Lionel scrambled off the bed, hands raised. Tameka, baby, listen. Rachel, wrapping the sheets around herself, stammered, it's not what you think. Tameka backed out of the room, her legs moving before her mind could catch up. The air in the house was thick, suffocating. She felt like she was drowning. She walked to the kitchen, her hands trembling, her body moving on instinct. She opened the drawer. Her fingers curled around the cold steel of the butcher knife. Footsteps followed her. Lionel. Tameka, please. She turned. The knife slashed through the air, sinking deep into his stomach. A choked sound escaped his lips. His hands flew to the wound, his body jerking backward. She stabbed him again. And again. And again. Blood sprayed across the white tiles, the warmth of it splattering onto her skin. Rachel screamed. Lionel staggered, his eyes pleading, his mouth forming words that never came. Tameka didn't stop. She had given him everything. Her love. Her trust. Her life. And he had thrown it all away. The kitchen was silent except for the distant wail of sirens. Tameka sat on the cold tile floor, her breath coming in slow, measured gasps. The knife was still in her hand, slick with Lionel's blood. Her white dress, once pristine and elegant, was now a gruesome canvas of deep red splatters. Across the room, Lionel lay crumpled, his body twitching in the growing pool of blood. His eyes were open but unfocused, his lips trembling as if trying to form words. He wouldn't get the chance. Rochelle was the one screaming. She had backed into the corner of the kitchen, clutching the bedsheet around her naked body, her face twisted in horror. With shaking hands, she grabbed her phone, her voice breaking as she spoke to the dispatcher. "He's been stabbed. He's dying, oh my God, please, send someone. Please." Tameka didn't flinch. She didn't move. The weight of what she had done settled over her, thick and suffocating, but there was no panic. No regret. Only silence. The sirens grew louder. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was seconds. Time felt unsteady, slipping between reality and something else entirely. Then the front door burst open. The police flooded in, guns drawn, barking orders. "Hands where we can see them." Tameka didn't resist. She let the knife slide from her fingers, the clatter echoing in the kitchen. 2 officers yanked her up, twisting her arms behind her back, cold metal snapping around her wrists. "Do you understand your rights?" one of them asked, his voice sharp and authoritative. She didn't answer. They led her out of the house, past Rochelle, who was sobbing into her hands. Past Lionel's lifeless body. Past the blood-soaked memories of the life she had built and destroyed in a single night. Outside, blue and red lights painted the quiet suburban street in flashes of chaos. A small crowd had already gathered, neighbors in nightgowns and slippers, murmuring to each other in shock. "Tameka?" someone gasped. She turned her head slightly. It was Sister Geraldine, one of the church mothers. Her face was twisted in disbelief. Tameka looked away. They put her in the back of the patrol car. The door slammed shut. As the car pulled away, she watched the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror. The home she had shared with Lionel. The home where she had prayed, loved, and built a life. The home where she had just killed her husband. The community would never see her the same way again. She wasn't the devoted First Lady anymore. She was a murderer. The moment the story broke, it was everywhere. Pastor's wife murders husband in jealous rage. First Lady of Triumph Tabernacle caught in a love triangle turned deadly. A holy union shattered by lust and betrayal. News anchors dissected every detail, filling the airwaves with speculation. Talk shows debated whether Tameka was a woman pushed to the brink or a cold-blooded killer. Social media exploded with theories. Some called her a victim. Others called her a monster. In Atlanta, Triumph Tabernacle became a spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the church, reporters shoving microphones into the faces of stunned parishioners. Some wept, unable to reconcile the image of the devoted First Lady with the brutal crime. Others whispered about secrets, about sins hidden beneath scripture and sermons. The congregation was divided. She was betrayed in the worst way. Who wouldn't snap? One woman said in an interview. A godly woman would never resort to violence, another argued. But the strongest voices came from those who couldn't believe their beloved pastor had been living a double life. Pastor Warren, with another woman. "I just can't see it," one church elder said, shaking his head. And yet, Rochelle's testimony would prove otherwise. Rochelle sat on the witness stand, her hands trembling in her lap. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye watching, waiting. She didn't look at Tameka. Instead, she looked down at her lap as she spoke. "Yes," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Lionel and I were having an affair." A murmur swept through the crowd. She inhaled sharply, as if bracing herself for the weight of her own confession. "It started a few months ago. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did." Tameka sat stone-faced, unreadable. Rochelle hesitated, then continued. "Lionel struggled with things he couldn't talk about. Things he was ashamed of." The prosecutor leaned forward. things. Rochelle's throat bobbed as she swallowed. He had desires. Desires he tried to pray away. Being with me made him feel normal. Someone in the audience gasped. The judge banged the gavel. Order in the court. Tameka didn't flinch. She didn't react when Rochelle recounted the night of the murder, the way Lionel had whispered frantic apologies even as he bled out. She didn't react and the prosecutor painted her as a woman so consumed by rage that she lost all reason. She didn't even react and the defense tried to argue that she had acted in the heat of passion. She simply sat there, hands folded, as though none of it belonged to her. The jury deliberated for 7 long hours. When they returned, the entire courtroom tensed. Tameka stood, her heart hammering, but her face an unshaken mask. The foreman cleared his throat. We, the jury, find the defendant. A pause. A breath. Guilty of second-degree murder. The room erupted. Some gasped. Others murmured in agreement. A few shook their heads, eyes glossy with emotion. Tameka didn't cry. Even as the judge delivered her sentence, 30 years to life, she remained still. No outburst. No plea for mercy. Just silence. As they led her away in cuffs, her eyes flickered to Rochelle for the briefest moment. Rochelle stared back, tears streaking her face. Tameka turned away. She had nothing left to say. The prison walls were cold, but Tameka had long since stopped feeling the chill. The clang of metal doors, the distant shouts, the suffocating routine, it all became background noise. She was no longer First Lady Warren. No longer the picture-perfect pastor's wife. Now, she was inmate number 54762. At first, the whispers followed her everywhere. The guards knew her story. The inmates did too. Some admired her, seeing her as a woman who had taken justice into her own hands. Others called her a hypocrite, a so-called woman of God who had let rage consume her. Tameka didn't argue. She just did what she had always done. She prayed. She found purpose in ministering to the women around her, many of whom had never set foot in a church, many of whom had stories just as tragic as hers. She led Bible studies in the common room, reading scripture to those who had nothing left to hold on to. She sat with young inmates in the middle of the night, listening to their confessions, their regrets, their desperate hopes for second chances. She wrote letters to Triumph Tabernacle, though they never responded. And when she knelt in her cell at night, whispering prayers into the darkness, she never once asked for freedom. She only asked for peace. She never spoke to Rochelle again. This case is a chilling testament to the fragility of trust, the weight of betrayal, and the darkness that can emerge when love is shattered beyond repair. Tameka Warren spent years building her life on faith, sacrifice, and devotion, believing that her marriage was ordained by God. But in a single, harrowing moment, everything she had known, everything she had believed in, was torn apart. Was it the betrayal that broke her? The humiliation? Or had the years of silent sacrifices, the pressure of perfection, and the fear of losing everything been building all along, waiting for the moment to explode? Lionel Warren was a man tormented by secrets he never had the courage to face. Rochelle Dillard played her own role in the downfall of a woman who had once called her a sister. And Tameka? She became both a victim and a villain, a woman whose pain erupted into violence, forever altering the course of her life. Was this a crime of passion, an uncontrollable reaction in the heat of the moment? Or was it something deeper, something festering beneath the surface for far longer than anyone realized? What do you think? Could this tragedy have been avoided? If this story shocked you, make sure to like and subscribe for more cases that uncover the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal.